Okay, so let's dive in. 1991. It's this moment where, well, what our sources describe as the biggest empire of the modern world basically collapses.
Right. Officially gone after 74 years. A huge historical moment.
Yeah, huge. And it wasn't just, the symbolic end of the Cold War. The material you shared really emphasizes that this also kicked off a whole series of really intense, bloody conflicts.
Across the former Soviet territories.
Yeah.
And the sources are pretty stark, saying the impact, the ripple effects are still felt to this day.
That's striking. And what's interesting is how the sources frame the very beginning. They point out this nuance, right?
Yeah, that while we often call it a collapse, it was technically, or at least initially, based on an agreement. The idea was for the republics to declare independence without bloodshed.
Which makes the violence that came later even more jarring.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A huge contrast.
Okay. So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack that story, the end of the Soviet Union, sticking strictly to the sources you've provided.
Okay.
And just to set the scene for everyone listening, the USSR, it was this massive union of 15 republics. Let's see, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan.
Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Russia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. Quite a list.
It really is. And the sources hint early on that one country, maybe one you wouldn't expect, Estonia, played a pretty significant role in starting the tremors.
Well, to really get why this was such a seismic event, the sources rightly take us back a bit first. They remind us, look, this wasn't the first time this political entity had crumbled.
Right. There was the earlier collapse during World War I.
Exactly. And it was the Communist Revolution, October 1917, Lenin, that kind of pulled those territories back together into this new Soviet state.
Okay. And then, of course, comes Stalin. The USSR becomes this major world power. The sources even mention Stalin annexing Estonia after defeating Hitler in World War II.
And crucially, the point is made that Estonia wasn't exactly a willing member. They always wanted independence, according to the material, never really had it under Soviet rule.
That feels like a key piece of background. Because after Stalin, the sources suggest later leaders didn't quite have that same iron fist.
Yeah, less centralized power, maybe. And this is when the sources say the USSR started to see some economic decline setting in.
And it wasn't felt evenly, was it? The sources detail this economic pressure really hitting the smaller peripheral republics harder.
Definitely. Places like Estonia, Lithuania, Moldova, Latvia, they felt overlooked by Moscow. And like you said, many hadn't chosen to join in the first place. They felt neglected.
The sources also paint a broader picture, saying it wasn't just a Soviet problem. The communist economic model itself, it wasn't really working out across the board, even in Eastern Europe.
That's the argument presented, yes.
Yeah.
The model was showing cracks pretty much everywhere it had spread, despite the ideology's global reach.
So things are simmering, and then the sources point to the mid-'80s as a real turning point, specifically Poland breaking away from communism.
Yes. The material uses strong language there, calls it a bomb landing in the communist world.
Why a bomb? What was the significance?
Because it showed it could be done. It basically gave other places, other republics, the inspiration, the idea that, hey, maybe we could break away too.
And that brings us right back to Estonia.
It does. The sources describe things getting rowdy there. People actually out in the streets, protesting, challenging the Communist Party.
But initially, it wasn't full separation they were after. The sources clarify the first focus was economic.
That's right. Economic independence first. They didn't want all their earnings going to Moscow to be redistributed. They wanted, control over their own economy.
And this catches the attention of the Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev.
He hears about the unrest, but the sources suggest he kind of underestimated it. Both how serious it was and how deep that desire for independence really ran among Estonian leaders.
Which sets up this key meeting in Moscow, 1988, right? 47 Estonian deputies basically go straight to Gorbachev.
Yeah, after a formal session, they approach him directly, lay out their case. We want economic freedom.
And Gorbachev's response?
An absolute no, according to the sources. And it wasn't just a simple refusal. The material links it to his core political vision.
We saw the dames.
He feared, and the sources say he was right about this, that if he gave one republic that kind of economic freedom, others would demand it too, and the whole Soviet Union would unravel.
So his refusal just throws fuel on the fire in Estonia.
Intensifies the conflict hugely, yeah.
And then external factors come into play. The sources mention Poland starting to support Estonia.
Yes. And also, crucially, in that Cold War context, The U.S. providing financial support to the Estonian protesters. That's highlighted as a key moment.
Okay, so you've got internal pressure, external support.
Right.
What happens next?
Momentum builds, especially among the Baltic states. They're Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. The sources say they formed a kind of union.
And their demands shifted.
They did. Their leaders started pushing for complete separation from the Soviet government, not just economic freedom anymore.
And Gorbachev's nightmare scenario starts coming true. That rowdiness spreads.
It does, to other parts of the USSR, even significantly into Russia itself. People there also started saying they didn't want communism anymore. Exactly what Gorbachev had worried about.
This is where Boris Yeltsin enters the picture. The sources call him one of the main elements, the main people behind the collapse.
Yeah, the central figure. At this stage, he's a senior Communist Party guy, but also president of Russia, the Russian Republic within the USSR, reporting up to Gorbachev.
The sources offer a pretty critical take on his motivations, though.
They do. They frame it primarily as selfishness and desire for power. Basically, that he couldn't stand taking orders from Gorbachev.
He's painted as self-centered, maybe a bit dictatorial, lacking long-term vision.
That's the characterization in the material, yeah.
Yeah.
Focused on immediate power gains.
And there's this specific point about his view of the Soviet economy.
Right. The sources suggest he had this misconception that all the USSR's wealth came only from Russia and was just being given away unfairly.
Not realizing other republics like Turkmenistan or Tajikistan were major contributors too.
Apparently not, according to this account. He seemed to think Russia was footing the whole bill.
And this perspective seems to fuel a really pivotal action in 1990. Yeltsin gives a speech.
A hugely important speech, yeah. Publicly backing Estonia's independence.
Wow. And the impact in Estonia.
Protests hit their peak, according to the sources. People actually went and occupied the Communist Party office there, a really defiant act.
How did Gorbachev react to that?
Badly, according to the sources. First, a threat. Then he sends in armored forces.
Military intervention.
Yeah. And the material describes this as a major misstep. It pushed the conflict from protests into, well, an armed phase.
And tragically, it led to violence. The sources mention an incident at the radio and TV station.
Yes, it was fired upon. 13 people died. The sources note this really changed perceptions. Many started seeing Gorbachev as a killer.
A turning point.
And Yeltsin, he jumps on it, according to the sources. Uses the situation to stir up more unrest, but this time within Russia. He gets public support, even some military units backing him.
So now Russia itself is demanding to leave the Union.
Exactly. The core republic wants out.
Okay, so we're moving into 1991. Things are accelerating fast. The sources describe a key moment in one of the last Soviet parliament sessions.
A dramatic moment. Estonia is officially given permission to separate. It's allowed.
And the domino effect Gorbachev predicted?
It happens. Almost immediately. Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, those other peripheral republics quickly declare their own independence, just as he'd foreseen.
The sources describe some powerful symbolic acts happening then, too.
Oh, yeah. Soviet flags coming down all over, their own national flags going up, and pictures of Lenin, of Stalin being burned in public squares. Very potent imagery.
But Gorbachev doesn't give up entirely. There's a final attempt to hold on.
A last-ditch effort, yeah. The sources describe him initiating a military coup in Russia to try and keep control of the center. He's moved to a dacha, supposedly for safety, during this.
But Yeltsin counters it.
He does. He's built up that support public military, and he successfully thwarts Gorbachev's coup.
And then he moves decisively.
Absolutely. While Gorbachev is still isolated at the dacha, Yeltsin signs documents recognizing the independence of key players like Ukraine and Belarus.
And then declares himself president.
President of an independent Russia. He seizes the moment completely.
There's a mention of a press conference afterwards.
Yeltsin appears, and when reporters ask about the fate of the Soviet government, he apparently just brushes it off. Says his only concern now is being president of Russia.
Wow. The end game.
Pretty much. The final act, according to the sources, is December 25th, 1991. Mikhail Gorbachev gives his last speech. He dissolves the Communist Party, declares the USSR is no more. History.
The empire falls. But as the sources really underscore, the story doesn't end there. The aftermath. It was largely what Gorbachev had feared, wasn't it?
Sadly, yes. The material is quite stark about what followed. It describes the immediate outbreak of very bloody wars in many of the newly independent countries.
Stretching right across the map.
From Eastern Europe through Central Asia, even touching the Middle East. And the sources use this phrase, the fire of these wars continues to this day. They also explicitly link this period to the formation of terrorist groups that are still active.
And what about Russia itself? What happened there immediately after?
Chaos, according to the sources, a huge surge in crime, criminal organizations, the Russian mafia, gaining unprecedented power.
Things the old communist government had suppressed.
Exactly. Plus, rampant money laundering, terrible poverty, even starvation in places. A really difficult, turbulent time.
And internal conflicts, too, within Russia.
Yes. The sources mentioned Dagestan and Chechnya declaring independence, leading to armed conflict, even suicide bombings hitting Moscow and St. Petersburg. It suggests Russia was basically in a state of civil war until around the year 2000.
And this rise of the oligarchs, the sources mention, by the mid-90s, they were essentially running the country.
That's the picture painted. Russian billionaires controlling things through money, violence, hiring killers, buying legislation. It sounds incredibly dangerous. Moscow itself is described as one of the most dangerous cities in the world for several years then.
High murder rates, robbery.
Endemic, yeah.
And was it just Russia, or were things bad elsewhere, too?
The sources suggest the situation was pretty dire in most of the other newly independent countries as well. Insecure borders, terrorism, internal conflicts, a widespread pattern of instability.
Can we look at some specific examples the sources give? The Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, they got their independence, but...
Initially, they faced really tough times. Major poverty, recession. They'd lost that Soviet financial cushion, however problematic it was, and the U.S. support that helped them protest eventually dried up.
Okay. And Moldova?
Described in the material as the poorest country in Europe since independence. Conditions remain dire, apparently, leading to huge numbers migrating seasonally just to find work. Plus, a large part of Moldova came under Russian control in 2014.
Right. And Ukraine.
Mentioned as the second poorest in Europe. Attempts to escape poverty failed, conditions worsened, and of course the sources highlight the 2014 annexation of Crimea by Russia.
And they mentioned that ceremony, people holding photos of Lenin and Stalin.
Yeah, singing the Russian anthem. A really striking detail that the sources include, suggesting complex feelings or maybe political maneuvering.
What about the Central Asian states? Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan?
The sources are quite critical here. They describe them becoming absolute dictatorships, with conditions arguably worse than under communism, still facing poverty, major economic problems left unresolved.
And ongoing conflict, too, Azerbaijan and Armenia.
Yes, the Karabakh conflict between them, a direct legacy of the Soviet collapse, and the sources state it continues to this day.
It's a grim picture overall, but the sources also mention something surprising. Nostalgia for the Soviet era.
It is surprising, isn't it? But yeah, the material gives examples. Older people in Moldova apparently still use old Soviet passports, believing things were better back then.
And Stalin's birthday celebrated in Georgia.
Annually, in public, in his hometown, according to the sources. And those Lenin-Stalin photos at the Crimea ceremony we mentioned, it suggests the memory of that era is complex and contested.
Okay, so this difficult, complex aftermath leads us towards more recent times and Vladimir Putin's rise. The sources highlight his famous statement.
Right, calling the collapse of the USSR a geopolitical catastrophe.
And the sources note how that landed in the West, particularly the U.S.
Very negatively. It was seen as potentially signaling a return to adversarial relations, a new kind of enemy.
And the sources point to actions taken by Putin that seem to reinforce that interpretation, reviving Soviet symbols.
Yes. Things like bringing back a modified version of the Soviet national anthem, making military uniforms resemble the old Soviet ones, the prominent use of the color red, even speaking more positively about Lenin and Stalin.
Symbolic moves, but also concrete efforts to rebuild influence.
That's what the sources argue. They mention Russia fostering political parties in Western Europe, Italy, Germany, France, and gaining really significant financial and political influence in the UK.
Leading to that term, Londongrad, in the British press around 2020.
Exactly. Reflecting the sheer amount of Russian money and influence documented there by the sources.
And the sources conclude that essentially a form of Cold War with the U.S. continues.
That's the suggestion. Though they do add a point that Russia itself is presented as one of the few former republics that has managed to improve its situation somewhat since the chaos of the 90s.
So we've covered a lot of ground, tracing the story from the sources, the fall of this huge empire,
to the incredibly varied, often very difficult outcomes for all the countries that emerged from it.
It really highlights the complexity, doesn't it? The long-lasting effects, shaped by history, by figures like Gorbachev with his foresight, and Yeltsin with his, well, immediate impact.
Definitely. And based purely on the material we've discussed, these accounts of ongoing wars, The roots of terrorism, persistent poverty, Russia's current actions, those continued tensions with the West.
Yeah.
It does leave you thinking.
It really does. It poses a pretty significant question for us and for you listening. How exactly is the legacy of the Soviet collapse, this story we've unpacked, still actively shaping the conflicts and the global dynamics we see playing out right now?